is Professor Emeritus at the University of Vermont and editor of the Marshall Papers. Dr. Stoller is a distinguished military and diplomatic historian and author of numerous books, including the acclaimed biography of Marshall, George G. Marshall, Soldier, Statesman of the American Century. Stoller's scholarship earned him the University Scholar Award at UVM in 1993 and the Distinguished Book Award of the Society for Military History in 2002. His equally distinguished teaching earned him the Dean's Lecture Award in 1992, the George V. Kidder Outstanding Faculty Award in 1984, and the Kröpsch Maurice Excellence in Teaching Award in 2006. In addition to teaching at UVM, Stoller has served as a visiting professor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, the U.S. Naval War College, the University of Haifa in Israel, the U.S. Military History Institute, Williams College, and Washington and Lee University. He is the former president of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations and a former trustee of the Society for Military History. So please join me in welcoming Professor Stoller.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm serious about tenure being the reason that I'm able to speak here. We can talk about that later. I'd like to begin, even though this is a lecture about the worst presidents, I would like to begin with the man who I think, and I think you will have to agree when I finish, beyond any shadow of a doubt, is the greatest president in all of American history, William Henry Harrison. He served only 32 days before he died before he could do anything wrong. Okay, now, I make that joke to emphasize the importance of clarifying the grounds for making judgments about past presidents. We just go ahead, oh, this was a great one, this was an awful one. What are the grounds? And I would argue this is especially important in dealing with our worst presidents. Now, what I would like to do tonight, if I can get my watch to start telling me what time it is so I don't run over. It's not going to. It's going to misbehave. So you may be stuck with me. I can talk for hours. I can see what time it is. I will finish before 8. I promise you. What I would like to do tonight is go through the standard list of the worst presidents in American history and the standard grounds for placing them there. Then I'd like to consider whether any past presidents from our lifetimes should be added to that list. I was terrified, by the way, that I would have an audience of undergraduates whose lifetimes would have only gone back 18 years. I think you and I are basically the same time period here. And finally, I would like to propose a new third ground for placing presidents in the worst list, and thereby add two, and they will shock you, at least one of them will, two who are usually placed in the near great list. I think they belong in the worst list. I am an iconoclast at heart. I don't see how an historian can be an historian if you are not an iconoclast. In fact, I used to say that the introductory courses that I taught in U.S. history should be entitled Iconoclasm 1 and Iconoclasm 2. But you will see when we get to that part. Let's start with the standard approach. The standard list of worst presidents, when I was a student, usually included 4 names. And a 5th was added during my professional career, largely at UVM. The 4: Franklin Pierce, 1853 to 1857. James Buchanan, 1857 to 1861. Ulysses Grant, 1869 to 1877. And Warren G. Harding, 1921 to 1923. The 5th that was added at a later date was Andrew Johnson, 1865 to 1869. Now, if you look carefully at the administrations of these 4 or 5, you can easily see that they were placed in this list on one of 2 grounds, either corruption or incompetence. They all fit that, okay? Grant and Harding, both clearly placed on the list because of the extraordinary corruption that occurred during their times in office. Let me give you just a few examples of what took place. Grant's Secretary of War, his private secretary, and officials in both the Treasury Department and the Department of the Navy were all involved in bribery or tax cheating scandals. And by 1875, several had been indicted for their corruption. Now, Grant himself remained honest. There was no corruption in regard to this individual. But instead of exposing the corruption of these others, he defended the culprits. Harding, oh boy. Harding's scandals were both personal and within his administration. Personally, he had a series of sexual affairs with other women that led to an illegitimate child and may have continued while he was in the White House. More damaging, the more things change, the more they remain the same, I know. More damaging were the corrupt activities of the cronies he appointed to office. And those of you who watch the HBO series, I just forgot the name, Boardwalk Empire, are familiar with some of these names. Charles Forbes of the Veterans Bureau was convicted of fraud and bribery in connection with government contracts. He went to federal prison. The Attorney General, Harry Dougherty, was implicated in bribery and other fraudulent schemes, and he escaped prosecution only by refusing to testify against himself. In other words, using the Fifth. The most notorious scandal of all, Teapot Dome. Here, the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, accepted bribes to lease government oil reserves, Teapot Dome being one of them, to private oil companies. And Fall became the first cabinet officer to be sent to jail for 1 year, as well as fined. Warren Harding said it perfectly. I have no trouble with my enemies, but my friends, my goddamn friends. They're the ones that keep me walking the floor nights. Some people have hypothesized, looking at this record, Harding died in office, supposedly of a heart attack or contaminated food. But some have hypothesized that he either committed suicide or was murdered by his wife, who poisoned him, given all the affairs that were going on. All right, those are the corruption presidents. Pierce, Buchanan, and Johnson, on the other hand, are placed on the list for incompetence. Pierce is put there primarily for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which he supported. We often talk Stephen Douglas proposed it, but Pierce supported it fully, wanted it. This act violated the old Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had allowed slavery below a certain line, but not above that line. Kansas had been above that line. Now Kansas and Nebraska were both opened to slavery. That wrecked the relative peace over the issue of extension of slavery that had been created by the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. What did you get out of this? The clear prelude to the Civil War known as Bleeding Kansas. Massacres on both sides. This is where John Brown first rose to fame or infamy, depending which side of the Mason-Dixon line you were living in. Pierce is also roundly condemned for the methods he chose to avoid the slavery issue. They boomeranged. Most notably, expansion. More expansion. Expansion into Central America, expansion into the Caribbean, but it just so happened that all the areas in which he pushed for expansion, Cuba, for example, taking it from the Spanish, were slave areas. And this push for expansion came to be seen in the North as simply a slaveholder's plot to expand slavery even more. He is also condemned for betraying his native New Hampshire and all of New England by siding with the southern wing of the Democratic Party. Buchanan of Pennsylvania is similarly condemned for siding with the Southern Democrats and for his gross ineffectiveness during the secession crisis of 1860. Little bit of background. As a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the uproar over slavery, the Whig Party collapsed. In its place emerged the Republican Party, brand new and a totally Northern party. Its basic plank of its platform, and there were many others, opposition to the extension of slavery into the territories. When they ran their first candidate, John C. Fremont, in 1856, they almost won. Their second one, Abraham Lincoln, in 1860, did win. I don't think Lincoln got a single vote south of the Mason-Dixon line, but he won every northern state, and that gave him a massive majority in the Electoral College. Popular vote total was only about 40%. He was elected by a plurality of the popular vote, but a clear majority of the electoral vote. With his election, the states of the Deep South, beginning with South Carolina, seceded from the Union. Buchanan is still president. Lincoln doesn't take over until March of 1861. What does Buchanan say and do? He says, secession is not legal. Well, then do something. Well, I can't do anything. The president doesn't have the power to stop this. And there he sits while the country collapses around him. In his defense, he had been chosen, things had gotten so white hot by that point, Buchanan had been chosen to run for president primarily because he had been out of the country for the last 4 years as the ambassador to Great Britain, and therefore had not been touched by his stand on this issue. But that's not the end of it. Buchanan is also condemned for his efforts to influence a pro-slavery vote in Kansas. Kansas had to vote on whether or not it wanted slavery. And he tried to bribe the people who were voting into voting a pro-slavery constitution. He also tried to influence, that's the nice word, manipulate, maybe closer to the truth, the Supreme Court when it decided the Dred Scott case. Now, here I may have a blind spot, so I'll ask you, how many of you have ever heard of the Dred Scott case? All right, good. Clearly, this is not a group of my students. This is everyone agrees, probably the worst decision the Supreme Court ever made. It ruled that basically a black could not be a citizen, that a black had to be a slave, that if the black had lived in free territory, that did not make him a free person, and that indeed the Congress had no power to ban slavery in any of the territories, meaning the entire major plank of the Republican Party was unconstitutional. According to the Supreme Court, what the Supreme Court actually did was remove itself as a body, an institution that might effect a compromise on this issue. Now, what about Andrew Johnson? He followed Abraham Lincoln, and he is placed on the list for his total incompetence in dealing with Reconstruction and with the Congress, which resulted in his impeachment by the House of Representatives. And in the Senate trial, he came within 1 vote of being convicted in the Senate. Now, fascinating fact, Johnson in earlier years was not placed on the worst list. He was considered in the first half of the 20th century to have been a victim of the so-called radical Republicans in the Congress and in the Senate. Now, this began to shift as a result of the civil rights movement during the 1950s and the 1960s. And during that time, Johnson's reputation began to plummet. His racism became crystal clear. The image of the radical Republicans at the same time started to go up because of their support for black civil rights. And if you want to see how far up the radical Republicans have come, compare what D.W. Griffith in Birth of a Nation had to say about them in the era of Woodrow Wilson with what your impression of Tommy Lee Jones playing Thaddeus Stevens in the recent Lincoln movie. And there you have it. Okay. At the same time, the reputation of Grant begins to go up because we see that Grant did attempt to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments in the South. A similar shift occurred with Andrew Jackson. At one point, Andrew Jackson was in the near great category, ranking about 6th on the list. In one of the more recent polls, he has slipped to 14th. Why? His behavior with Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, his behavior in terms of slavery, the gag rule whereby abolitionist petitions could not be read in Congress, also his support for censorship of the Southern males so that abolitionist literature could not circulate within the South. And finally, the awful economic consequences of his fiscal policies, which triggered the Depression of 1837. On the other side, Dwight Eisenhower's reputation has shot up. In the first poll after Eisenhower's presidency, he received a rating of 22. In the more recent polls, about 9. Now, what are we seeing here? We're seeing that I need a little water, excuse me. All of this clearly illustrates how changing societal values affect presidential ratings. So does the question of who is doing the rating. Historians, for example, and the public often reach very different conclusions. Historians consistently agree on the 3 greatest presidents, if not the order. They disagree on what the order is, but they all agree. Washington, Lincoln, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt are the top 3. The public, in a 2011 Gallup poll, the public agreed with the historians on only 1, Lincoln. The other 2 they listed were Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. Figure that out. The public's rating of Harry Truman, which was at an all-time low in 1952 when he left office, went way up in the 1970s and the 1980s. At the same time, his ratings went down amongst historians. Now, I was asked recently, well, if historians and political scientists do these ratings, is there a difference if you're a liberal historian versus a conservative historian? And the answer is a lot less than you think, okay? The top 10, they are in fundamental agreement, if not the order, okay? The bottom, they are in fundamental agreement, except when you get to the last 30 years. And that's where the differences begin to show. Conservative historians put Reagan in the top 10. Liberal historians definitely do not. Liberal historians put George W. Bush in the worst category. Conservative historians do not. But except for the last 30-plus years, their ratings are very, very basically the same, with just a few differences. There is also a constant tension in judgments regarding which is the worst sin. Is it incompetence or is it corruption? There's also a growing recognition of major accomplishments in both the Grant and Harding administrations. Okay? Harding, for example, had some of the worst cabinet officers in all of U.S. history, but also some of the best. Okay? Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State. Andrew Mellon as Secretary of the Treasury. An efficiency expert and humanitarian, the hero of the 1920s as Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, before the crash and the Depression. Grant, similarly, the attempt to enforce Reconstruction. You can go on and on and on here. Now, on these two grounds, corruption and incompetence, one could argue that anywhere from 2 to 4 presidents from our lifetime could be placed on the worst list. Let's look at the 4. And the 4 that could be placed there, some argue, are, in chronological order, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. Note how even-handed I am. 2 Republicans and two Democrats here. On what grounds? Nixon, for the corruption of Watergate. This is clearly the most serious scandal in all of American presidential history, and one quite different from the previous scandals. Here, the corruption was not about money, and it was not about sex. Instead, it was about power and the rule of law. Members of the Nixon administration claimed that the president was above the law, that the Constitution simply did not apply to the presidency. In addition, once the tapes were totally released, it became clear that the president had played a central role in the cover-up of a felony, which was in itself a felony. And when that became clear, it led to his forced resignation to avoid what clearly would have been impeachment and conviction in the Senate by both parties. The evidence was crystal clear. Jimmy Carter, for sheer incompetence regarding the economy, the Cold War, and the Iranian hostage crisis, resulting by 1980 in some of the worst inflation in all of American history, the botched Iranian hostage rescue mission, the resignation in protest of Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, and the perception that we were losing the Cold War, all of which led to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Bill Clinton for the Monica Lewinsky sex scandal and ensuing lies to the grand jury that led to his impeachment. And we were treated to that lovely exposition on the meaning of the word "the." And excuse me, yeah, I'm sorry. And finally, George W. Bush for corruption of power similar to Nixon in Watergate, and a similar threat to rule by law, and for incompetence as exhibited by the war in Iraq, the explosion in the national debt. The budget was balanced when George Bush became president. We actually had a surplus. And the financial and economic collapse of 2008. If you really don't like George Bush, you can claim, as I did during his presidency, what we have here is a combination of the incompetence of Jimmy Carter and the corruption of Richard Milhouse Nixon. Now, let me come back, though. While tempting to include at least some of the 4 in the worst list, as an historian, I cannot do that. I cannot include any of them for one simple reason. It is too soon to see the full consequences of their actions. That is absolutely true for Bush, who has only been out of office for 4 years. But it is also true of the others. During the Clinton impeachment scandal, I was called by a reporter from the Burlington Free Press who asked me, "How will this look in 10 years?" My answer was, well, that depends on what happens over the next 10 years. And the reporter said, that's exactly what your colleague and my dear friend, Professor Samuel Hand said. But Sam, who loved the joke, quipped, historians don't predict the future. Historians predict the past. Similarly, the consequences of Carter's incompetence are not yet clear, especially in regard to Iran, while the consequences of Nixon's corruption are not yet completely clear, especially in light of the additional powers claimed not only by Bush, but by President Obama as well. There has not been a rolling back of these powers, not at all. It takes time for consequences to spill out. My favorite comment in this regard comes from the Chinese Communist leader Zhou Enlai. He was asked what the significance was of the French Revolution. His comment, too soon to tell. There's an Asian concept of time that is a bit different from ours. Okay, now on the other hand, the consequences of the incompetency and/or corruption of Pierce, Buchanan, Johnson, Grant, and Harding are now crystal clear, I would say. For Pierce and Buchanan, the Civil War. You talk about an awful consequence. What could have been worse? For Johnson, the utter failure of Reconstruction and a century of vicious race relations. For Grant, the ensuing 3 decades, 3 of the most corrupt decades in the history of American politics, and a return to those awful standards under Harding after the relatively clean presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and William Howard Taft. But, now let me flip it a little bit. If you agree with me on all of this, then implicitly you're agreeing that corruption and incompetence are not the only 2 standards, that there is a 3rd category for judging presidents, the long-term consequences of their actions, the obvious one. Now, you don't have to agree with that, and there are a lot of people who won't. For how long should a president be held responsible for the consequences of his actions, given the fact that he is no longer in power to affect those consequences? A few examples. Are Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower to be considered as responsible for the Vietnam War as John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, since it was Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower that made the first U.S. military commitments to the area? Or is that a travesty, given the fact that the commitment remained less than 1,000 Americans until John Kennedy became president? By the way, you have, of course, that huge debate. What would Kennedy have done had he lived? And here, you've got evidence on both sides. You have documents on both sides. You have documents where Kennedy says, it's up to them. We're going to have to get out. And you've also got documents where he said, we cannot lose this area to the communists. So what do you believe here? I go back to a fact. When John Kennedy became president, there were 900 Americans in South Vietnam. When he died, there were 17,000. Okay? Needless to say, I don't buy Oliver Stone's version of John Kennedy. So do Truman and Eisenhower bear any responsibility? I say yes, at least for planting the seeds that would lead to the disasters of the 1960s and the 1970s. I was once asked, what was the worst mistake that George Marshall made? And I had to really sleep on that, and I came up with 3 or 4. And what was fascinating about all of them is that they were totally justifiable in their time, totally understandable in their time. It was only in hindsight that we see how wrong those judgments were. And I think the same can be said here. Neither Truman nor Eisenhower had any idea that what they were doing would lead to over 500,000 American troops in Southeast Asia. Similarly, following this logic, I would like to add two names to the list of worst presidents on the grounds of the long-term consequences of their actions. Interestingly, both men are often included in either the great or the near great category. And I would argue, and this is where maybe the fur will fly a little bit, that they are grossly overrated. Now, the first one, many of you may have never heard of, James K. Polk. In fact, the battle cry of the Whigs in the election of 1844 was, "Who is James K. Polk?" Okay? He was a very important political figure, but he has gotten buried in American history for the most part. In the first presidential poll of historians taken by Arthur Schlesinger Sr. in 1948, Polk was rated as near great, and that was the shocker. Why? Polk served only one term. He entered office saying, "I will serve only one term, and I will accomplish 4 objectives during those 4 years. I will acquire California from Mexico. I will create a sub-treasury system to replace the Second National Bank that Andrew Jackson destroyed. I will lower the tariff, and I will settle the Oregon controversy with Great Britain." And he did all 4 of them. All 4 in 4 years. An incredible accomplishment. Great myth, by the way, is that he also added Texas. He did not. His predecessor, John Tyler, added Texas. And Tyler is usually very close to the worst president list for not seeing all hell that would break loose by doing that. All of his predecessors did. Texas remained independent from 1836 until 1845, because Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, Henry Clay all realized that bringing Texas into the Union would lead to an explosion over the issue of slavery. Tyler didn't care about that. Now, carrying this out, how did Polk achieve these goals? Okay, the sub-treasury system and the tariff, he had a Democratic majority in Congress. The Oregon controversy with Britain, he threatened war with Great Britain, 54-40 or fight. And he backed off from that only because he did get a war with Mexico. He planned the war with Mexico. That war led directly to the Civil War only a little more than a decade later. Now, again, keep in mind what I mentioned earlier. The South seceded not over the issue of slavery where it existed. No one questioned that except the abolitionists, who were a very small minority within the North. Lincoln didn't question it. Lincoln said he would guarantee, by constitutional amendment if need be, the continued existence of slavery in the states which were already slave states. The South seceded over the issue of the extension of slavery into the new territories. And without those new territories, none of the events of the 1850s that led to the Civil War would have occurred. And one might argue that the Missouri Compromise could and would have held. Now, I'm dealing with counterfactual history here, if history. We will never know that. We will never know that. What we do know is that the explosion over what to do with California, with all the territory that Polk had taken in from the Mexican War, that is what the fighting would be about during the 1850s. Furthermore, Polk had plenty of evidence regarding the catastrophic impact of aggressive territorial expansion, including the leading of a divided nation into a war of conquest, which is what Polk did. The nation was savagely split over the Mexican War. Congress at one point was threatening to cut off funds. In fact, there never was a declaration of war. What Polk did was fascinating. He ordered General Zachary Taylor and an army into disputed territory between Texas and Mexico, the area between the Nueces River, which the Mexicans claimed was the boundary of Texas, and the Rio Grande River, which was where the Texans claimed it was. Okay? He ordered Polk into that territory, and when the Mexican army challenged Polk and hostilities ensued, he argued that American blood had been shed upon American soil and asked for a declaration of war. But the declaration of war was attached as a rider to the Army Appropriations Bill, so that if you voted against war, that war exists by act of Mexico, you were voting against supporting the troops who were under attack at that point, okay? The Whigs, who were opposed to the war, voted for it. They were trapped by this. They remembered what had happened when the Federalist Party had opposed the War of 1812 and had disappeared as a national political party as a result of that. But this split emerged as the war went on. In fact, one freshman congressman got up and challenged Polk to name the spot on which American blood had been shed upon American soil, because it was not American soil, it was disputed soil. It was an unknown freshman congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln who said that, and he got the nickname Spotty for doing that. Polk ignored all of this. He blindly led the country into war. He blindly ignored the consequences. The one time in which reason spoke to him, he gave up on the idea of acquiring all of Mexico, just adding the whole country to the U.S., seeing how badly split the country was. And besides, what are we going to do with all these Mexicans who are not white and are Catholic? Too much of a mess. We won't do that. I would argue Polk, blinded by self-righteousness and a lust for land and glory, played a major role. It was not just Pierce and Buchanan, it was also Polk. I have one more candidate for the worst list. The tongue here is only slightly in cheek, very slightly. Thomas Woodrow Wilson, whom I consider the most overrated president in American history. Now, he had a lot of accomplishments, no question about that. But let's look at the negative side. Supposed progressive, the epitome of the progressive movement, opposed women's suffrage, was responsible for the expansion of racial segregation in the federal government so as to encompass all of Washington. Establishment of the country's first propaganda bureau during World War I, the virtual outlawing of dissent and the trampling on the civil liberties of anyone who opposed U.S. entry into the war. There were laws passed that rank with the 1798 Alien and the Sedition Acts in terms of violations of civil liberties. It is also under Wilson, admittedly after his stroke, but he's still in office, that his Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, launches the Palmer Raids and what becomes known as the first Great Red Scare. That is a record of some of the worst violations of civil liberties in U.S. history. What about foreign policy? Supposedly, Wilson is a pacifistic president who was forced into World War I. Woodrow Wilson is responsible for more military interventions than any other president in American history, by my count. And let me list them. World War I, of course. Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Mexico, twice, the second time with a full army, and Russia. And every one of these was a failure by the standards that Wilson enunciated and simply led to more problems. The interventions in Latin America were supposed to create stable democratic governments. They failed wretchedly. The only result was greater hatred in Latin America for the Yankee Colossus. The intervention in the Russian Civil War failed to overthrow the communists who had seized power there, and probably increased popular support for the communists within Russia. It also poisoned Russian-American relations and helped sow the seeds of the Cold War. As for the intervention in World War I, it did help the Allies to defeat the Germans, but it failed wretchedly to achieve Wilson's stated aim of, quote, making the world safe for democracy, the war to end all wars. Yeah, that peace treaty that Wilson helped to negotiate basically planted the seeds for a Second World War, or round two of the European Civil War 20 years later, as well as the problems we have lived with since. The destruction of all the multinational empires in Europe and the Middle East. I find that all of a sudden, my students and the general public have a longing for a return to the Ottoman Empire. Given, at least that was peaceful and quiet. Ottoman Turkey was the sick man of Europe, but it's not bad to be sick for 500 years and maintain some sort of stability during that time period. But this is destroyed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is destroyed. I'll never forget, at the Naval War College of all places, one of my colleagues was defending the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the concept of multinational empires, as opposed to nation states, as Wilson wanted, and the ensuing fragmentation of Europe, which ironically made Germany potentially even more powerful than it had been before the start of World War I. You break up Austria-Hungary, you break up the Ottoman Empire, you cripple the Russian Empire, though Stalin will bring it back. The collapse of the Soviet Union is the collapse of the last multinational empire from the 19th century, interestingly enough. But I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent there in terms of the problems we still live with. Wilson also is, now, Wilson was responsible for great successes as well. And I will admit that. And that's what makes these ratings so difficult, okay? Nixon, for example, there's Watergate. But on the other side, there is the opening to China. There is détente with the Soviet Union. There is the Environmental Protection Agency. One could argue that Richard Nixon is the last great liberal of the 20th century if you look at the domestic policy. So you've got that. But I always have felt that Wilson has been grossly overrated, which is why I have overstated this case by presenting only the negative side. But as a good historian, I have to tell you there is another side to that. But the worst thing may be the establishment of an ideology embraced by American liberals in the 20th century, and then by American neoconservatives in the 21st century, of global crusades to make the world safe for democracy, or to quote Wilson's words as he sent an army into Mexico, I shall teach them to elect good men. It's a direct quote. Never realizing the incredible arrogance inherent in such statements and the extent to which other cultures would interpret this as nothing more than hypocritical imperialism to be resisted by whatever means possible. Wilson's ultimate legacy in this regard is George W. Bush's War on Terror, which used the same Wilsonian rhetoric. So did his father, by the way. New World Order. Where did that come from? And is proving, all of this is proving to be even more of a failure, or at least as much of a failure as Nixon's crusades. While I'm attacking everything, let me also attack the whole concept of a war on terror as a military absurdity. Terror is a military tool of the weak. It has been for thousands of years. You don't make war on a military tactic. May make war on terrorists. That's another matter. And that is a guarantee of endless war. But if we look at it in this light, Wilson's legacy is really very similar to Polk's legacy. A massive expansion of American power and influence. Polk made the United States a continental power, one ocean to the other. Wilson made the United States one of the, if not the great power of the world. But the cost of this expansion of U.S. power and influence was incredibly bloody future warfare. So, there's a lovely symmetry in ending with this, because those of you in the audience who would love to place George W. Bush in the worst category had better consider throwing in one of your heroes and his ideas as well. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we have time for some questions.
And I have a little microphone that is helpful because it picks it up for the MCTV. So if you could speak into the microphone. We have a question back here.
I can't believe I'm going to attempt to rehabilitate James Buchanan. It's a mighty load, and I'm not equal to it. But as a native from Pennsylvania a long time ago, my friend, who is an emeritus professor from Temple University, which is my university, is moved to Lancaster and is a history buff. History's not his area, and has started as a docent in Wheatland, which is Buchanan's home, and is probably America's only Buchanan reenactor. It's not a big field. And so I wrote to him about tonight because, of course, James Buchanan was pictured on the flyer for tonight. Yeah. And he wrote me imploring me to raise this one issue, and I sort of boiled down all his questions to this one I would pose to you, please, which is, prior to the attack on Fort Sumter, what are the policy differences and rhetorical differences between Buchanan and Lincoln prior to Fort Sumter? Prior to Fort Sumter.
I will answer it, but can I do a little? Okay. Historians are all, or should all be, revisionists, always willing to reconsider their conclusions. Now, I received, when I did a course for the great courses company called The Skeptic's Guide to American History, and I lashed into some of these presidents, I got an angry email from someone in New Hampshire who heads the Franklin Pierce Society. And she pointed out all the wonderful things that Franklin Pierce had done, conveniently leaving out Kansas-Nebraska, bleeding Kansas, things like that. But there is always room for revisionism. Before Fort Sumter, what is the difference between Buchanan and Lincoln is a very good question. And by the way, Lincoln would not have a very high rating in half of the country in 1864 in terms of the importance of the passage of time before we see these things. The difference is that Lincoln said he could do something, whereas Buchanan said he could not do anything. And Buchanan may have been constitutionally correct, but as an executive, he has sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States. He is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And to sit there and say, I can't do anything, Lincoln says, I can do something. Now, he tries first to reassure the Deep South, offering the constitutional amendment, trying to get them back in. And when that fails, he turns to Fort Sumter, and then with the firing on Fort Sumter, he calls for volunteers, at which point the Upper South secedes, and you have a full-scale civil war. Let's not mistake facts here. And again, I've got problems with the movie Lincoln, but I love the fact that it shows you just what it takes to get certain things done from a political point of view. It's not always a pretty story, okay? And there are exaggerations in the film. There are distortions in the film. But Lincoln, there's a wonderful little book by James McPherson, the great Civil War historian, on Lincoln as a commander-in-chief, how Lincoln learned to be a military commander. I think the two greatest military commanders we ever had as president were Lincoln and FDR. And both of them grew into the job, so to speak. Nobody thought that Lincoln knew anything about strategy. He didn't think that he did. But he grasped what was going on. He grasped the essentials where all of his generals missed it. So I would say that. Listen, if Grant is coming up a little bit and Harding is coming up a little bit, why not Buchanan and Pierce? But I took a look, and Buchanan is still at almost every poll at the very, very bottom. But still worth talking about, absolutely.
We have another question? Yeah, well, the lady in purple.
Okay.
You gave the impression that Wilson really didn't have to enter the war, except the First World War, except, quote, to make the world safe for democracy. This resulted that today, are we fighting to make the world safe for democracy, or are we fighting against the terror in other countries and possibly ourselves?
Okay, if I can rephrase the question so everyone can hear it. The implication, or because it wasn't my desire, but the inference that could be drawn from what I said was that Wilson didn't have to enter the First World War, that he did it for reasons of trying to make the world over rather than defend the national security of the United States. And similarly, is the war on terror an attempt to make the world over in our image or protect the national security of the United States? Is that fair? Okay, yeah, it's a very good question. Wilson was forced into the war, primarily by the German declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare in late January of 1917, followed by the idiocy of the Zimmermann telegram, which the British had intercepted, in which the German foreign minister told his ambassador in Mexico to offer the Mexican government the return of Texas, New Mexico, and California if they would make war on the United States. Now, these were the most isolationist parts of the country before that became public. You can imagine what happened there. When I teach U.S. entry into World War I, my interpretation is, yes, in 1917, he's forced into it. But he's forced into it by diplomacy that I find severely defective in 1915 and 1916, during the Lusitania crisis and during his attempted mediation efforts. That just an inept diplomat, in my opinion. One of the great what-ifs to me, American history, the election of 1912 is one of the most fascinating elections in all of American history. Where you have 4 candidates really running. William Howard Taft, the incumbent in the Republican Party, Woodrow Wilson, Democratic Party, Theodore Roosevelt, the Bull Moose Party, and Eugene Debs on the Socialist Party. Okay? Now, Debs was not going to win, but Teddy Roosevelt could have won. And Teddy Roosevelt, for all his bluster as president, was a brilliant diplomat. And I often wonder what would have happened if Roosevelt had been president in 1914 when World War I broke out. He stopped war from breaking out in 1906 during the, I forget if it was the first or the second Moroccan crisis, by his secret diplomacy. He also won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Treaty of Portsmouth, ending the war between Japan and Russia. We have this image of this crazed cowboy shooting off his 6 guns. Is a very different Roosevelt who is president of the U.S. He might have led the United States into the war earlier. He might have threatened the Kaiser with that and thus prevented an outbreak of war. Wilson did nothing. Now, he had a good reason. His wife had just died. And we tend to forget that these presidents are human beings. And his mind was not exactly focused on this. But the question really is, was a German victory in World War I a threat to the national security of the United States? And I think here, and historians disagree on this, I think we tend to confuse Germany in World War I with Germany in World War II. Now, German historians fight over this as to whether there is continuity or not. And clearly, the American entry into the war turns the tide. By the time the war ends, the Americans are occupying 25% of the Allied line, and they are pouring in at such a rapid rate that the German General Staff cracks under the pressure and says, that's it. But I think that we could have, short of totally entering the war, we could have protected our security. Now, the big question really, oh boy, this is one that can keep me going. The real question is American security threatened by a hegemonic power on the European continent? That is the question throughout the 20th century. With Nazi Germany, the answer of the Roosevelt administration and the overwhelming majority of the public was yes. Similarly with the Soviet Union after the war. But I'd be careful about projecting that back to 1914 to 1918. It's not really clear. Okay, now, the question of 9/11 and the war on terror, clearly protecting our own security was the primary objective. It's the primary objective of every president. That's what he has to do. And I say he simply because of past history. I could be saying she very, very soon. We don't know. But it appears that to sell war to the American public, and maybe the presidents feel they need this to sell it to Congress and even to themselves. They have to phrase it in these universalistic terms of remaking the whole world. And it is a very, very dangerous way to conduct foreign or military policy. The great American diplomat and writer George F. Kennan, the author of The Containment Doctrine against the Soviet Union, once in this regard compared foreign policy in a democracy, as he put it in one of his lectures, to one of those prehistoric monsters with a body the size of this room and a brain the size of a pin. You virtually have to whack its tail off to make it aware that its interests are being threatened. But once you have awakened it and aroused it, it acts in such fury, such blind fury of having been awakened, that it destroys not only the threat, but its entire habitat in the process. And this is the way we tend to go to war. We seem to have to believe that our interests are threatened and that we can make the world over and create a brave new world. And that's the part that I argue is really, really dangerous. Not sure if that totally answers your question.
To a degree, thank you.
Okay, I think we have one more time just for a short question. The gentleman over there.
Yeah, in the last 30 years, here are 3 events that I wonder if you think would rise to the level of affecting the position. One is Nixon's undeclared war in Cambodia, and the second is the Iran-Contra affair, and the third is the repeal of Glass-Steagall.
How many people know what Glass-Steagall was? Okay. Now, as the Glass-Steagall, let me work backwards. For incompetence, yeah, Yeah. Although I've heard many economists say we overrate that as a factor, that it was a factor, but really not a big one, that there were other things that were a lot worse in terms of what had happened. Incompetence is one word. Sheer, unbridled greed would, I think, be a better term for what happened here. And even the former head of the Federal Reserve Board said he was stunned by that. He shouldn't have been. He shouldn't have been. If you look at human history, you will see that again and again and again. Nixon and Cambodia is linked to Watergate. They're really inseparable from each other. Cambodia was a secret war conducted off the books. The books were doctored, okay? The plumbers who break into Democratic headquarters in the Watergate building, why are they called the plumbers? They were formed to plug leaks, starting with Daniel Ellsberg's release of the Pentagon Papers and the fear that this would occur with Cambodia and other actions. So I put all of those under the Watergate umbrella. Iran-Contra, I'm saving for last because it's the most difficult to answer. It's a good question to ask. It is not, as I read it, and I could be dead wrong here, you know, it did not have the blatancy of what went on during Watergate. It also had a large degree of Keystone Cops. And you know, bringing a cake to the Ayatollah, you know, all these lunatic things. And when you get all the pieces together, it's a miracle that anyone was able to keep track of what was happening here. Because what you're trying to do is sell arms to the Iranians in their war against Iraq, even though you've been favoring the Iraqis, using the Israelis, of all people, as middlemen in order to get money to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. And also the congressional rules were constantly changing on what the Congress would and would not allow the president to do in regard to Nicaragua. So that one, I guess I would like to sleep on. You know, it is, you know, there is a corruption of power there. There's also incompetence there, the way the whole thing blew up. But no president has an absolutely perfect record, and no president has an absolutely perfect record of failure. It is always a mix, and that's the most difficult thing to figure out. When you've got that mix, what do you count when you assess them? Which is why I began this lecture with, what are your values that you're bringing to the table here? Where do they come from historically, culturally, and every other way? Hope I've answered that somewhat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think he'll be able to stay for a few minutes.
A few minutes.
If you'd like to come up and